My name is Wade Davis, and I'm Explorer in Residence of the National Geographic Society.
Great. And just also for the camera, how many places have you been on the planet?
I was in 30 countries last year alone. I have no idea.
Okay, so the whole planet, so you've been around.
Yeah, I work all over the place. Yeah.
Great. All right, so in your travels, this is basic, and the other thing about this film, I'll just step back, is we're really trying to get to some basic concepts, because I think we need to start from a basic place to understand where we are in the world, what is the world, and then we break it down for people. So,
Sure.
So it's an obvious question, but how is the Earth described by Indigenous people? You've met a lot of them, obviously.
Well, the most important thing is that there is no such thing as a indigenous person. You know, the great revelation of anthropology is that the world into which you were born doesn't exist in some absolute sense, but is just one model of reality. The consequence of one particular set of choices that your lineage made, however successfully, many generations ago. But all the peoples of the world teach us that there are other ways of being, other ways of thinking, other ways of sort of orienting yourself on the planet. And that's an idea that, if you think about it, really can only fill you with hope. And so if you think of people as, you know, as social species, every culture of the world shares the same basic imperatives. We all have kids, we all have to deal with our elderly, we all have to find a way to come together to have children. But given that foundation, there are then possibilities for infinite flowers to bloom from the garden of the human experience. As we sit here today, there are 6,000 languages spoken on Earth. Now, a language, which is a reflection of a culture, is not just grammar and vocabulary. Its means are the vehicle through which the very soul of a culture comes into the world. Every language is like an old-growth forest of the mind, a watershed of thought, an ecosystem of social and spiritual possibilities. And one of the really dark backgrounds of our age is that just as we're losing biological diversity, the loss of plant and animal species and the loss of the habitats that support that life, so too are we losing languages, and if anything at a far greater rate. Of those 6,000 languages spoken the day that most of us were born, today fully half are not being taught to children. They're not being whispered into the ears of babies, which means that effectively they're on the brink of extinction. Now, this collapse of cultural diversity, of course, is echoed by the collapse of biological diversity. And in many ways, the forces that are affecting the one also affect the other. And so when you say, what do the indigenous people, there is no such thing as the indigenous people. You know, the human society has been around for maybe 200,000 years. It's important to remember that the Neolithic Revolution that gave us agriculture and specialization, hierarchy, all the tools of modern civilization as we know it, was only 10,000 years ago. Modern industrial society as we know it, which is just in and of itself the reflection of one way of doing things, is only 300 years old. And that shallow history shouldn't suggest to any of us that we have all of the answers for all of the challenges that will confront us in the ensuing millennia. These other peoples of the world aren't failed attempts at being modern or failed attempts at being us. On the contrary, by definition, they're unique manifestations of the human heart, of the human imagination. When asked the meaning of being human, they respond with 6,000 different voices. And collectively, those voices become our overall human repertoire for dealing with the challenges that will confront us all in the ensuing millennia. And this is why it's important to understand what is the relationship between different cultures and the environment upon which they depend. You know, we have a kind of almost romantic notion that somehow we in the West, perhaps because we live such harried lives, are somehow more frustrated or more cut off from nature. The implication being that somehow these indigenous people are somehow closer to it, almost in a biological sense, which is an idea that is derived right back to Rousseau and the silly canard of the noble savage, this idea that these people are somehow genetically closer to the earth than we can be. Nothing could be further from the truth. You know, indigenous people all around the world are just like us. They have their children, they have their families. They're neither sentimental nor are they weakened by nostalgia. At the same time, we have this idea that somehow indigenous people are more like Henry David Thoreau than we could ever be, as if they're more contemplative than nature, as if they're somehow more conscious of their role in it. Again, most of the time, indigenous people are just like all human beings, struggling to find a way to better the lives of their children, to survive in an uncertain universe. There's not a lot of room for sentiment in the chilling winds of Tibet, or for nostalgia in the harsh slopes of the high Andes. But indigenous people around the world nevertheless have forged through time and ritual a kind of traditional mystique of the earth that's based not on a self-conscious sense of being close to it, but on a far subtler intuition. And this is what's important, the idea that the earth itself only exists because it is filtered through the human imagination. Now, what do I mean by that? I was raised a scion of the Western industrial world, raised in the rainforests of British Columbia, to believe that those forests existed to be cut. That idea was the very foundation of the ideology of scientific forestry that I was taught in school and I practiced as a young logger in the forests of my own country. Now, that idea and that conviction made me a profoundly different human being, and more importantly, gave me a very different relationship to the natural world than my friends amongst the Quaghiuth, who believed that those forests were the abode of Hukuk and the crooked beak of heaven, and the cannibal spirits that dwelt at the north end of the world, the spirits that would have to be embraced during the Hametza initiation so that the wisdom of the wild could be brought back into the potlatch. Now, was that forest mere cellulose and board feet, or was it the domain of the spirits? That's not the operative question. The interesting observation is how the belief system itself makes for a different human being, and therefore makes for a different relationship to the natural world, and that has consequences. I've spent a great deal of time, for example, in the high Andes of Peru. Now, in the Andes, a place where the people truly believe that the earth is alive, vital, responsive in a reciprocal way to every one of their spiritual aspirations and desires, they believe that every village is dominated by a sacred mountain, an Apu, that will direct the destiny of each child raised in that village. Now, is a mountain a truly sacred being, or is it, as we might be taught in Montana, simply a pile of rock ready to be mined? Again, the interesting thing is not which is correct, but how the belief system changes the relationship between indigenous people of a place and the landscape. And this sense of spirit of place is perhaps the most powerful distinction between indigenous people and the rest of us from the West, for example, who have learned, whether we like it or not, to be really almost scavengers, wanderers, traveling across the planet. You know, I once, in my own home of British Columbia, there was a big dam development being proposed for a mighty river called the Stikine, the sacred artery of the Tahltan Indians. And there was a public event at the local reserve, a place called Iskut, and there was a kind of a hippie back-to-the-lander who stood up in what he thought was a gesture of solidarity, and he said, you know, if they build this dam, I'm just going to have to leave this country. And right after he spoke, a friend of mine, a young Tahltan, stood up and with immense dignity and quiet, he said very simply, you know, partner, that's the difference between me and you. If they build this dam, I'm still going to be here. And that commitment to place, that sense of loyalty to landscape, is probably the most powerful single trait that distinguishes our world from that of many of these indigenous cultures where I've spent so much of my life. Now, it's important to back up, too, and realize that, you know, all cultures are famously ethnocentric, sort of fiercely loyal to their own interpretations of reality, not just we in the West. The word barbarian, for example, derives from the Greek barbarous, meaning one who babbles, and if you didn't speak Greek, you didn't exist. The Aztec had the same notion in Nahuatl. Now, so we tend to see ourselves in the West not as being what we are, which is just a culture. You know, all of our economy, all of our way of doing things is simply one constellation of traits that has come together to be the expression of who we are as a culture. We don't realize that. We tend to think of ourselves as the inexorable wave of history, and that all these other cultures of the world are quaint and colorful perhaps, but somehow destined to fade away as if by some natural law, as if they're failed attempts at being modern, failed attempts at being us. Again, nothing could be further from the truth. In every instance, these are dynamic, living peoples being driven out of existence by identifiable forces. And that's actually an optimistic observation because it suggests that if human beings are the agents of cultural destruction, we can also be the facilitators of cultural survival. Now, when you look and realize that the West, the culture, the tradition most responsible for the impact of industrial society on the planet, is just that, a culture, you can begin to look at the parameters and the traits of that culture, not to be gratuitously negative, but simply to be observant. You know, I've often said, you know, if an anthropologist came from Mars to the Earth and looked at the United States, for example, they clearly see many wondrous things. And if the measure of success was technological wizardry, we'd certainly come out on top. But if they looked at our social structure, they might ask some interesting questions. They'd say, well, here's a people that revere marriage, but half their marriages end in divorce. They say that they love their grandchildren and revere their elders, but only 6% of American homes are prepared to have grandparents and grandchildren beneath the same roof. We say that we love those children and our homes and our families, but then we embrace a peculiar slogan, 24/7, implying total dedication to the workplace at the expense of family, and then we wonder why the average American youth by the age of 18 has spent 2 full years passively watching television. When you add that social structure, or those parameters of culture, to a worldview, the very foundation of which, the economic engine of which, by any scientific definition, is compromising the biochemistry of the biosphere, you suddenly say, we're many wondrous things, but the paragon of humanity's potential we most assuredly are not. And these other peoples aren't failed attempts at being us. They're unique answers to the fundamental question, what does it mean to be human?
That was amazing. Really great. So, in our cultural soup that we're in, and since we obviously have, like you said, a lot of technological wizardry that's very powerful, obviously it's impacted the planet.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to speak to how we've impacted the
Sure.
planet, because we have a lot of that, but if you want to lend your perspective, please
Sure.
do. But then in that, how then, since it is a take on how the world is and it's so ingrained in our cellular DNA and our cultural DNA, how do we change
Yeah,
if we need
sure, I can do that.
to shift? And it's not about glorifying another way of life, it's how do we evolve, really?
Right.
What in us
Sure.
can we go to? What are the resources that we have?
Okay, let me just add one more thought to the previous, and I'll
Okay.
jump right into
Great,
that. Okay.
great.
One of the things that we forget when we forget that we ourselves just are a culture is that we have made certain choices through history. And if you try to really understand the origin of the Western ethos, you really have to go back to the Renaissance and the kind of liberation that the Enlightenment brought on in the wake of the Renaissance from the kind of tyranny of the church. In many ways, the Enlightenment that led to the celebration of the individual was a great sort of inspiration of the human imagination. It cut the individual free from the constraints of the orthodoxy of the church, the tyranny of faith. And we forget, though, that in doing that, we also cut the individual adrift from the foundations and comfort that faith and that community brings. And we take that liberation of the individual in the West as a given, but it was actually the sociological equivalent of splitting the atom. Because in most human societies around the world, the community has always counted more than the individual, because without the strength of the community, the individual will perish. And so in cutting loose the individual, we also cut the individual adrift. And I think that and in the course of that sort of intellectual development, we came to kind of dismiss all notions of myth and mysticism and intuition, of metaphor. We began to embrace this sort of cult of positivism. If a phenomenon couldn't be physically measured, it could not be real. If things didn't exist and be quantifiable, measurable, they couldn't exist. So all the elements of myth and intuition and mysticism and faith that had really not just fueled the human imagination since the dawn of time, but also given comfort to it, given it a sense of place, was sort of swept aside. And I think that alone can begin to account, because you have to find some possible explanation to account for the callous way in which we treat our only home. It's really, truly remarkable to think about. People often ask me, well, what's biodiversity and why is biodiversity important? Well, it's important for any number of reasons, not the least of which is that there's not a single species of life that scientifically we fully understand. Who could have guessed just a century ago that a humble fungus growing on the rind of an orange would lead to the development of antibiotics, which have transformed Western medicine and, of course, saved countless millions of lives. We forget that the bounty of the earth as it once was. I once traveled to a couple places just in the United States that in a perhaps more sensitive world would have been memorialized for the ecological tragedies that occurred there. And the first was a patch of forest on the banks of the Green River in Ohio, not far from Bowling Green, which was the site of the last great flock of passenger pigeons in North America. Very few people realize that at one point, really in the lifetime of my own great-grandparents, passenger pigeons made up 40% of all birds in North America. Flocks were so big that they contained 2 and 3 billion birds. Audubon describes it being on his horse and buggy outside of Louisville, Kentucky, and traveling to town to have the entire sun eclipsed by flocks of birds that literally would darken the sky. When a flock like that would land on a forest in the Midwest, trees the size of oaks would snap off like toothpicks from the sheer weight of the birds. Summer landscapes would become winter landscapes from the accumulation of guano. And that incredible expression of God, if you will, of the beauty of life itself, was utterly annihilated. You know, during the 19th century, pigeon meat was a mainstay of the American diet. And for those who could afford to eat beef, the minority, they found ways to kill their birds through sport. In fact, we had gentlemen hunting clubs in New York City that would catapult to their deaths 50,000 live pigeons in a weekend until diminishing supplies of passenger pigeons forced them to turn to clay pigeons in skeet shooting. The term stool pigeon in English derives from a killing technique of the era. You would simply, as a hunter, have to capture a bird, sew its eyelids shut, tie its legs to the top of a pole, put the pole in the ground, and its cries would bring in the flocks in such abundance that they could be simply beaten from the sky. Well, when I left that patch of woodland, I traveled west to lecture at a small college in Iowa, and I was fortunate to be taken to a small remnant patch of tall grass prairie, an ecological formation that once carpeted all of North America from Manitoba to Texas. And as a young botanist was with me, was sort of celebrating the poetics of the herbs that snapped at our feet in that winter landscape, my own imagination was going to the horizon, and I was trying to remember or imagine the physics of waves as millions of buffalo moved through that tall grass prairie. You know, as recently as 1871, buffalo outnumbered people in North America. You could stand on a bluff in the Dakotas and see nothing but bison to the horizon. The herds had grazing areas the size of the state of Rhode Island. And from the height of their population in 1871 to their reduction to a zoological curiosity only took 7 years. We have this idea that the buffalo somehow disappeared as the consequence of the inexorable progression of the American frontier. Nothing could be further from the truth. It was a deliberate act of bioterrorism. It was an attack by the cavalry on the great cultures of the plains, and it was a way of taking away the commissary of those great plain cultures. And when the last of the buffalo were reduced to a shadow on the prairie, and the last of those great elders was reduced to servitude in the reservations, Philip Sheridan, the Civil War general who had orchestrated the campaign, suggested to the U.S. Congress that a commemorative medal be minted that would have on the one side of it a dead buffalo and on the other side a dead Indian. Now, as I stood in that remnant patch of tallgrass prairie in Iowa, looking across a landscape of cornfields, positively claustrophobic in its monotony, punctuated only by corn silos, that stored the product of the land to feed the hogs, it struck me that the most remarkable thing about it is that for the people of Iowa today, good and decent folk, as nice as any people can be, the time of the buffalo is as irrelevant to their lives and as distant from their lives as is the fall of Troy or the battles of the Roman Empire. Yet amazingly, it happened within the lifetime of their own grandparents. And this fluidity of memory, this capacity of human beings to forget, is the most frightening aspect of our species, because we forget what once was, and we find a way to adapt to conditions that present themselves, conditions that would have been intolerable to our ancestors. I'd lived a long time in Haiti, a country that was, as recently as the 1920s, carpeted by one of the richest dryland tropical rainforests of the Antilles. And today the forest covers about 2%, and people try to squeeze a living from fields of stones. And I was standing with a voodoo priest on top of a ridge, and he began to as we looked over this sort of wretched, half-hearted landscape of scandent vegetation, and he began to wax eloquent as if words alone could squeeze beauty from that desolate wasteland. And he, of course, I, of course, looked out in that landscape and saw locusts. He saw angels. Both of us were only partially right. He perhaps did more honor to the human imagination, to the human heart, but biologically, of course, I was much more correct. And this ability to desecrate our only home is an astonishing thing. One of the reasons we're able to do it is the nature of our perspective. But fortunately and mercifully, that perspective changed forever on Christmas Eve of 1968, in the most seminal event of human history. I've spent a lot of time seeking out the astronauts, because every one of them seems to have come back from space transformed. And one of my favorite is a man called Story Musgrave, the first physician to walk in space. And Story and I once were on a panel in the Barbados, and also speaking was Richard Leakey. And I was sandwiched between these two great men, and it was a kind of an odd and moving juxtaposition of the endpoints of the human experience. Here was Richard Leakey, who with his mother and father had drawn from the dust and ashes of Africa the story of the birth of our species. And here was Story Musgrave, the first physician to walk in space. And the irony wasn't lost on Story, and he described what it had been to be in space. I mean, there he was, traveling 26,000 miles an hour, in perpetual free fall, 250 miles above the surface of the planet, the golden visor of his helmet illuminated by a single sight, a blue planet, as he recalled, floating in the velvet void of space. And Story later told me that to have experienced that sight, a sight that was only made possible by the brilliance of the human ingenuity and the human imagination, and then to recall the callous way in which we treat our only home, was to know the purest sensation of horror. And that vision of the Earth from space only brought to us when I myself was 12 or 13 years old. It's going to have a more incredible impact on the human destiny than even the Copernican revolution of the 16th century that finally showed us that the Earth was not the center of the universe. Because what we see at last from space is not a limitless horizon or the stunning products of human beings. We see a very finite orb, the fifth rock from the sun, floating in space, a little veil of life circling in a big, dark universe. One of the most remarkable things that I find in my work is I spent a lot of time in the Everest area. And in fact, I'm working on a book on the early efforts to climb Mount Everest. And everybody's heard about the death zone. You know, that you can, if you climb a mountain and you get up above 8,000 meters, you know, your body begins to decay, you can't breathe, the oxygen isn't there. But people forget the real meaning of that lesson, the power of that metaphor. It means on Earth, we can get out of a tent in the morning and walk with our own two legs up a mountain and get to a place where we can no longer breathe. If that doesn't tell you how thin this little fragile veil of life is that surrounds the planet, nothing will. And so the great hope is that that vision of the Earth from space will indeed prove to be catalytic. You know, it's interesting. In 1968, when that first came to us, when those astronauts went around the dark side of the moon and emerged to see not a sunrise or a moonrise, but for the first time in human history, an Earthrise, when they went around the dark side of the moon, you know, in that year, just getting people to stop throwing garbage out of a car window was considered a great environmental victory. Nobody knew the word biosphere or biodiversity or the significance of species lost. Now those terms, biosphere and biodiversity, are part of the language of school kids. You know, nobody had this idea that the Earth could actually be seriously and permanently impacted by the human species. But now, you know, no one doubts it. You know, only 20 years ago, people who suggested that global climate change was heating up the biosphere were dismissed as the radical fringe. Now it's those who deny the reality of climate change who occupy that lunatic fringe. And so, you know, there's a great possibility for hope here because we have finally woken up and we have no choice but to proceed together in a pluralistic, multicultural world which celebrates the wonder of who we are and the place that is our home. Well, you know, one of the things that in America, people are so insulated by our astonishing concentration of wealth. I mean, Americans spend more money maintaining our lawns than India collects in federal tax revenue. Our defense budget, which is a trivial percentage of GDP, is larger than the entire economy of Australia. So kind of anesthetized by our own wealth, we forget how the majority of the world lives, and indeed how the majority of the world looks. And wherever I go in my travels, whether it's the heart of the Amazon, the remote reaches of the Arctic, the forests of Borneo, or the oceans of the South Pacific, you see this astonishing consequence of modern human intrusion upon the environment. I mean, it's just unbelievable, whether it's deforestation in the Amazon, in the forests of Borneo. I mean, I lived once with a nomadic people in Sarawak, the East Malaysian state on the northern third of Borneo, a people who in the year of my birth had been 40,000 strong, living in the forest as nomads, echoing the wandering ways of all of our collective ancestors, because it was only 10,000 years ago that we settled down and the poetry of the shaman became the prose of the priesthood. We succumbed to the cult of the seed, as Joseph Campbell said. And nomadic people are so profoundly different. You know, in a nomadic society, there's no incentive to accumulate possessions because everything has to be carried on your back. So you ask yourself, what is a measure of wealth in that kind of culture? Well, you actually discover that the measure of wealth is perceived explicitly to be the strength of the social relationships between people. That is the currency of the society, because without that bond and without that collective commitment to the well-being of all, everybody can die. In a nomadic society, sharing becomes an involuntary reflex because you don't know who will be the next to bring food to the table. I once watched a little Penang woman tear apart a cigarette and individually distribute the strands of tobacco equitably to every hut in the encampment, rendering the product useless but honoring her obligation to share. Now that entire world of the Penang, morally inspired, inherently right, fully deserving of being, fully replete with lessons for all of us, has been swept away in a single generation by the most egregious, outrageous deforestation ever to be seen on the face of the earth. So whether it's from the forests of Borneo to the forests of the Amazon, whether it's from the high Arctic where there's no longer any ice, in 3 weeks I'll be traveling to northwest Greenland to do a report on the Inuit people who, clinging to their traditions doggedly because of the respect that they have for their ancestors, are suddenly finding themselves, despite their will, incapable of pursuing the ancient ways because the entire world around them is changing. The ice is melting. The animals, as a result, are dying. This is not somewhere from the fringes of environmental hysteria. This is a demonstrable scientific fact. The measurable consequences of global climate change. We are involved in a process where we're not only having an impact on the biodiversity of the oceans, having swept the oceans clean of any number of species of fish, having seen the overall populations of fish simply collapse, to the impact that we're having on the entire systems of the world, the atmosphere itself. We are ripping holes in the heavens, tearing down the ancient forest, changing the very temperature and biochemistry of the atmosphere upon which we depend. Again, we forget how abundant this world once was. You know, when the explorers first came to the New World from the Americas, people like Jean Cabot and Jacques Cartier and Samuel de Champlain, all the great heroes of my country, Canada, as they sailed from England across the Grand Banks fishery, the great cod fisheries off the shore of Newfoundland, Jean Cabot in his journals writes that even with a full head of sail, his ships could not proceed from the sheer density of codfish in the waters around his vessel. You hear about the size and the scale of the buffalo on the Great Plains when they outnumbered people in North America, flocks of passenger pigeons that contain 2 and 3 billion birds, an abundance of biological wealth that almost defies the imaginings. And when you go, as I have gone, to, for example, the tropical rainforests of the world, where in a place like Borneo or in the Amazon you can have as many species of trees in a 10-acre quadrant as will be found in all of North America, north of Mexico, where you see in this hotbed of evolution the extraordinary manifestation of life that is the great wealth of the planet. And you see the callousness with which that can be destroyed for the most short-term and thoughtless goals. It's enough to make the heart crack.
That was wonderful. That was great.
People often ask if there are grounds for optimism, and my answer is to say we have no choice but to be optimistic. And we tend to be incredibly impatient with the pace of social change. But if you think about it, it's grounds for tremendous optimism. I mean, just think about it. In a single generation, we've witnessed women going from the kitchen to the boardroom. We've witnessed gay people going from the closet to the altar. We've witnessed people of color going from the woodshed to the country club or wherever. In other words, we have shown how our society, particularly in America, is incredibly resilient, incredibly capable of adapting to new imperatives. And the real question in all of this, both in terms of both biological and cultural diversity, is a very simple one. What kind of world do we want to live in? Do we want to live in a kind of monochromatic world of monotony, or do we want to embrace a polychromatic world of diversity? You know, Margaret Mead, the great anthropologist, said just before she died was that her greatest fear was that as we sort of drifted toward this blandly amorphous generic world, not only would the entire range of the human imagination be reduced to a more narrow modality of thought, but that we would wake one day as from a dream, having forgotten that there were even other possibilities of life. The whole quest in what we're trying to do as anthropologists is not to freeze people in time. You can't make a rainforest park of the mind. We're not trying to stop the pulse of history, which would be impossible. We're simply asking, what kind of world are we going to live in? And we're trying to find a way that all peoples can engage in the genius of modernity without that engagement having to imply the death of their ethnicity. Because whether it's the loss of biological diversity or the erosion of cultural diversity, both issues are no longer about environmentalism. They're about geopolitical survival. You cannot have a G8 conference if the environment is not on the agenda. You cannot have a multilateral engagement at the UN if people are not copying to the reality of global climate change. All other affairs of human beings are swept aside in terms of the priority of us understanding how we are going to reverse this erosion of the biosphere, the collapse of the very foundations of life upon which all sentient beings depend. You know, one of the great sort of moments of the Western encounter occurred when the Europeans first washed ashore in Australia. And the Victorian English sailors took one look around and were repelled. What really offended them about the Aborigine people was not simply that they were quote-unquote primitive, but they had never embraced a cult of progress. They had never decided to improve upon their world. And for the Victorians, that was completely anathema. I mean, if there was one kind of motto of Victorian age was progress and improvement. And the British asked the question, why haven't they embraced the cult of progress? And of course, the obvious English response of the industrial age was to say they're savages, they're ignorant, they're primitive. Nothing could be further from the truth. Why did the Aborigine people for 60,000 years move so lightly on that landscape, burning it perhaps occasionally for the ungulates, but fundamentally having no serious footprint on that great continent of Australia? Well, if you understand the dream time and the dreaming, the answer is self-evident. Dreaming is an abstraction in the West, and so the word was used for what the Aborigine people told us about their lives. But what they took to be the dreaming was not an abstraction. In the Aboriginal mind, there were two parallel universes. There was the world of the physical, the world of the phenomenological, and there was the world of the dreaming. And when a young lad went on the walkabout, walking the song lines, what the song lines were the trajectories, the itineraries that had been walked at the dawn of time when the ancestral beings sang the world into existence. And when the young boy went on the walkabout, he was by definition engaging in an act of remembrance and homage to the ancestors. But more importantly, he was engaged in an act of creation, because the world at his feet both existed but was waiting to be born in the dreaming. In other words, the rock at his feet both existed but only existed because it was being filtered through his imagination. So his act of movement through sacred landscape was both at the same time, it was an act of remembrance and inherently an act of creation, because the world both existed in the moment but was always waiting to be born. So how could you possibly embrace the cult of progress in a universe that hadn't taken shape yet? Isn't that a wonderful story?
That
That's
is
amazing.
fantastic.
I had no idea
That's what the
where
dreaming
songlines
is.
came
That's
from.
what the songline is.
Wow.
That's what the songline is.
I never,
The first part of our film is about the wonder of humans, so this could easily fit in there
Yeah.
if we haven't, you know.
Well, you know,
Maybe 10 hours
the
long.
really important, I
the
mean,
movie's gonna be 10 hours.
you understand, I mean, one of the most important things that people don't understand is there's so much talk about biological loss, and people forget about the loss of languages. You know, and maybe I could give you one quick soundbite on that.
It's
you
so
know.
interesting that you even brought that up because
Yeah.
someone else brought that up this morning that there were 6,000 languages.
It was
but they
Stuart
didn't.
Hemp.
Yeah.
who was here
Yeah,
earlier.
this is a lot of this is my whole ethnosphere thing. I mean, this is my mission at the JIG. You know, people forget in all of our concern for the erosion of biological diversity, we forget that there's a parallel process of loss, which is the erosion of our own human legacy, the erosion of what you might call the ethnosphere. And you could define the ethnosphere, the cultural or social spiritual web of life that envelops the planet, as being the sort of the sum total of all thoughts and dreams, ideas and myths, intuitions and inspirations brought into being by the human imagination since the dawn of consciousness. The ethnosphere is humanity's great legacy. It's a symbol of all that we've achieved and the promise of all that we can achieve as a wildly creative and innovative species. And just as the biosphere is being severely eroded with the loss of habitat and the concomitant loss of plant and animal life, so too is the ethnosphere, but if anything at a far greater rate. No biologist would say that 50% of all forms of life are on the brink of extinction, because it simply is not true. And yet that, the most apocalyptic scenario in the realm of biological diversity, scarcely approaches what we know to be the most optimistic scenario in the realm of cultural diversity, and the great indicator of that is language loss. When you were born, there were 6,000 languages spoken on Earth. Now, language is not just grammar and vocabulary, it's a flash of the human spirit. And of those 6,000 languages, today, fully half aren't being taught to children, which means that effectively they're on their way to extinction. But think about what that means. It means, by scientific definition, in a generation or two, we are losing half of humanity's accumulated wisdom, knowledge of the spirit, intuitions about the nature of life, relationships to the natural world. Half of humanity's repertoire slipping away in a generation. And there are many people who say, well, wait a minute. Wouldn't the world be a better place if we all spoke one language? Wouldn't communication be facilitated? Wouldn't it be easier for us to get along? And my answer to that is always to say, what a great idea. But let's make that language Yoruba. Let's make it Haida. Let's make it Tibetan. Let's make it Quechua, Guarani. You know, and then suddenly you begin to feel, as a native speaker of English, what it would be like to be enveloped in silence, to have no way to pass on the wisdom of your ancestors or to anticipate the promise of your descendants. And yet that dreadful plight is indeed the plight of somebody, somewhere, roughly every fortnight, because on average every 2 weeks some elder dies and carries with them into the grave the last syllables of an ancient tongue. And this is a very vital and essential thing to understand, because the same forces that are affecting cultural diversity are affecting biological diversity. You know, when we think of culture, we think, you know, these people are somehow quaint and colorful, but failed attempts at being modern, destined to fade away, as if they can't keep up with change. Well, you know, change is the one constant in history. All peoples, in all valleys, have always been dancing with new possibilities for life. Change is no threat to culture, nor is technology. I mean, the Lakota Sioux did not stop being Lakota when they gave up the bow and arrow in favor of the rifle, any more than an American farmer stopped being an American when he gave up the horse and buggy in favor of the automobile. It's not change or technology that threatens the integrity of culture. It's power. It's a crude face of domination. In every case, these are not frail and fragile societies destined to fade away, any more than the forests in which they live are destined to be felled. These are dynamic living peoples being driven out of existence by identifiable forces. And the same forces affecting the cultures, egregious industrial decisions, intrusions that are biologically unsustainable, disease entities, the ideological force of political or industrial ideas, all of these forces sweeping over the planet are the forces created by human beings. And if human beings are the source of the problem, we can be the foundation of the solution. I think one of the things in forgetting that we ourselves are a culture is that we forget that when we project around the world, say, an economic system, call it globalization or what have you, we present it as if it's the inexorable wave of history, as opposed to what it is. One means of organizing economic activity that came out of our particular cultural lineage. And we project it overseas with the assumption that if people somehow buy into it, they're going to somehow magically achieve our level of prosperity. Well, as E.O. Wilson says, just on the level of energy consumption alone, it would take 4 planet Earths to support the energy consumption per capita that we enjoy in the United States. Ain't going to happen. And what indeed does happen is either drawn by the allure of the modern, coerced into it, seduced into it, people turn their backs on their past, hoping perhaps to achieve our level of affluence, but invariably they secure only a place on the lowest rung of an economic ladder that goes nowhere. And if there's one thing that history and anthropology in particular teaches, is that culture is not trivial. Culture is not feathers and bells. Culture is the blanket of ethical and moral values that we insulate the individual with and keep at bay the barbaric heart that history teaches us lies just beneath the surface of the living. It is culture that allows us to find sense out of sensation, to find order in a universe that may have none. It's culture that allows us to do as Lincoln asked us to do, to look for the better angels always of our nature. And if you want to know what happens when culture is lost, and yet the individual survives, kind of a shadow of his former self, cut adrift from the foundations and comfort of tradition, but facing an uncertain future of economic chaos, you only have to look at Mogadishu. You only have to look at the shining path at the gates of Lima, the Maoists at the gates of Kathmandu, the chaos of places like Equatorial West Africa. You suddenly see that culture is not trivial, and the maintenance of both the integrity of culture and the integrity of the ecological systems upon which cultures depend is not an issue of romantic nostalgia. It's an issue of geopolitical survival.
I still want to get back at loops. Why do you think that is, and why are we continuing? What are the forces that are overcoming our natural proclivity to survive?
Right, or common sense.
What's overriding that? I mean, when you see holes in the ozone, you
Right.
see glaciers melting, and we're getting the media, we're seeing global. I mean, forget about those people who believe in global warming. I mean, we get it. I mean, obviously, the cellular and a subconscious level, we must be all. And we feel it. We all feel it. Why? What's overriding this?
I think, people, who are aware of these issues are often kind of dumbfounded. Why aren't we waking up? What keeps us from approaching these issues at the level of crisis that they appear transparently to be? I think the answer to that is that, in a sense, we are. It's just that these challenges have come at us with such extraordinary speed. I mean, you have to recall that a generation ago, none of these problems were on the horizon. Deforestation was never seen to be a problem in the Amazon, even as late as the mid-1960s. The biosphere had hardly been defined by that point. Nobody had any data on the impact of the emission of hydrocarbons that I know about in the 1950s. It wasn't even part of the landscape of scientific imagination. The impact of human beings seems to have reached a kind of critical mass, and at the same time, I think the response to it is coming toward a critical mass. Maybe not as fast as we would like, and maybe not as quickly as should be the case. But nevertheless, the very fact that we're all out there speaking about these issues, the fact that terms like biodiversity are part of the vernacular of school children, people understanding what a species indeed is, people understanding that what we do on this side of the planet affects that side of the planet, that whole kind of unitary model and vision of the Earth that only came to us in 1968 from the view of the Earth from space during the Apollo program. I mean, we must not give up hope because the pace of response is slower than it should be, because the merciful thing is that the response is there, it's growing, it's going to reach a crescendo, and it's going to result in the transformation of human society and of our relationships to our only home. Again, to be somewhat perhaps patient with ourselves, it's very difficult to develop the notion of protecting something that you don't have the capacity to impact. And for most of human history, we did not have the capacity to truly impact, in a horrific sense, the planet Earth. This capacity really has only existed for the last perhaps 200 years of a history of our species that goes back for 200,000 years. So I think that as we become we have to remain sympathetic with ourselves as we now recognize that we most assuredly do have the impact to change the biochemistry of the atmosphere. We do have the capacity to rip holes in the heavens with the depletion of the ozone. We have the ability to tear apart from the fabric of life the very foundations that the natural systems represent. And so this is a process that we're going through as we begin to more sensitively understand our place in the universe.
Great. Well, we have time for now.
Okay.
I wonder if we have a time capsule question that will just...
Change is the one constant in history, and all peoples, all natural systems have constantly been dancing with new possibilities of life, and it would be my fervent hope that the actions that we're undertaking today, in the early part of the new century, in our era, will somehow be seen 1,000 years hence as a true fulcrum in the history of our species, the moment when we finally woke up to realize the impact that we have on this planet and to realize our capacity to transform our own relationship with the natural world, so that as we move into a new era of true stewardship, of appreciation, a revitalization of notions of the spirit, where we somehow allow science to merge with spirituality, where we take the genius of the scientific paradigm, fuse it to the warmth of the human heart unleashed through spiritualism, that somehow we will find a new way to leave to your descendants the earth that we inherited from our parents.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Okay?
Yeah.